A dog has never met you before. You walk into a room full of strangers, and within 4 seconds it crosses the floor, tail low, nose forward, and sits at your feet. The person standing right next to you gets nothing. No acknowledgement. No approach. Just a flat, steady stare from across the room, and then a slow turn away. You did not call the dog. You did not offer food. You barely moved, but something in you registered as safe, and something in the person beside you registered as a threat, and the dog made that calculation faster than either of you formed a conscious thought. People who witness this usually reach for one explanation. That person just has a way with animals, and they move on, satisfied. But that is not an explanation. It is a placeholder, because underneath that 4-second moment is one of the oldest and most specific conversations happening in the animal world, a conversation running in a language that most humans stopped fluently speaking somewhere around the time we built walls and stopped needing to know what was watching us from the tree line. This is not instinct in the way people usually mean that word. Wild animals avoid humans by default. That is what tens of thousands of years of being hunted, trapped, and displaced produces. The baseline relationship between the human species and almost every other mammal on this planet is stay away. So the real question is not why some animals distrust humans. Every animal has a solid evolutionary reason to do exactly that. The real question is why any of them ever stopped, and what those specific humans were doing differently from everyone else in the room. The answer reaches back further than any dog, any farm, or any fence. It reaches back to what threat actually looks like in a body, and why some bodies broadcast it constantly without knowing it. If you're enjoying this so far, hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I actually read them. The assumption most people carry into this question is a warm one. Animals sense kindness. They feel energy. They know, somehow, when a person is good. It is a comforting idea. It is also not entirely wrong, but it is not the whole picture, and it is not specific enough to be useful. Because the research tells a story that is considerably more granular than ambient goodness, and considerably more grounded in physical fact. In 2009, a behavioral ecologist named Claudia Vinke at Utrecht University in the Netherlands began a structured study of how domestic cats in shelter environments responded to different categories of human visitors. The working assumption in animal welfare at the time was that anxious or fearful cats were simply poorly socialized, that the primary variable was how much early human contact the cat had experienced in kittenhood, and that adult behavior followed more or less mechanically from that developmental window. Vinke's team found something more granular. It was not just whether a cat had been around humans, it was which humans were in the room at a given moment, and what those humans were doing with their bodies before any contact was initiated. Cats in the same shelter, with identical documented histories and the same staff-rated sociability scores, showed completely different response profiles depending on who walked through the door. The differentiating factor was not tone of voice, not gender, not experience with animals, not even the presence of food. It was posture, gaze direction, and the timing and geometry of the approach. When staff entered and moved directly toward the cat's position at standing height with forward eye contact, stress markers elevated. Heart rate went up. The cats retreated or froze in place. When unfamiliar visitors entered, sat at an angle to the cat's position rather than facing it directly, and simply waited without initiating contact, those same cats approached and made physical contact within minutes, sometimes less. The animal was reading a script, and the script was written in a language that predates domestic cats, predates the species boundary between cats and humans, predates almost everything we think of as civilization. Here is what that actually means. The behaviors that signal safety to an animal are not random acts of gentleness. They are not vibes or intentions or emotional frequencies. They are a specific set of physical signals that map directly onto how those animals parse threat in the wild. Direct eye contact, in the social vocabulary of almost every mammal on Earth, signals predator focus. A direct forward approach at full standing height maps onto pursuit. The absence of a lateral presentation, meaning your profile is not visible to the animal, suggests you are not passing through, that you have a terminal intention toward the specific location the animal occupies. When a human unconsciously removes those signals, by angling their body, by directing their gaze sideways, by moving in a curve rather than a straight line, by stopping and becoming still rather than continuing to close distance. The animal's nervous system receives a fundamentally different message. Not this human is kind. Something more precise and more ancient. This entity is not in hunting configuration. That distinction matters far more than most people realize. It separates avoidance reduction from approach. And approach is a different thing, driven by a different mechanism with a different history. In 1966, a Russian geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev began one of the longest and most consequential behavioral experiments in the history of animal science at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, Siberia. On paper, he was studying fur quality in silver foxes. In practice, he was attempting something no one had done in a controlled setting: replay the process of domestication in real time to identify what actually changed when a wild animal became a domestic one. Belyaev selected breeding pairs from a farm fox population based on a single criterion: not temperament broadly, not playfulness, not size or health or any other trait, just the single behavioral variable of reduced fear response to human proximity. The foxes that fled the least when a human approached were the ones that reproduced. Within 6 generations, something unexpected began to happen. The selected foxes were not merely calmer around humans. They were actively seeking human contact, tails wagging, moving toward the enclosure when handlers appeared, vocalizing when handlers left. Within 20 generations, they were producing sounds never recorded in any wild fox population, vocalizations with no analog in the known behavioral repertoire of the species before the experiment began. Within 40 generations, their behavioral profiles were statistically indistinguishable from domestic dogs on standardized assessments of social bonding, play initiation, and human-directed communication. Belyaev died in 1985. His colleague Ludmila Trut continued the experiment for decades after. By 2005, the selected foxes were initiating extended play sessions with complete strangers, a behavior not documented in any non-domesticated canid population in the existing scientific record. What the Novosibirsk experiment revealed was not simply that foxes could be tamed given enough time and patience. It revealed something about the architecture of distrust itself. The physiology of fear, when systematically reduced through selection across generations, leaves room for something that was always there but had been suppressed. The foxes did not learn trust as a trained behavior. The systems that had been generating distrust were gradually dialed back, and what remained was an animal capable of doing something its ancestors had not been able to do, capable of choosing contact with a different species. Which is why the question of why some animals trust some humans and not others cannot be answered with personality alone. Trust in animals is not a personality response. It is a physiological one, built on systems that were shaped over millions of years of evolution, and those systems are responding to information most humans are not aware they are broadcasting. To understand why that is, it helps to understand what fear actually is in the body of a prey animal. When a deer senses a predator, a cascade of hormones floods its system within milliseconds. Cortisol, adrenaline. The pupils dilate. Hearing sharpens. The digestive system shuts down to redirect blood to the muscles. Every non-essential function goes offline so that the single function of escape can draw on everything the body has. This is not a metaphor for anxiety. It is a physical state of total biological emergency. Now consider what happens when that same cascade activates, repeatedly, in the presence of the same human. The association between that human and that emergency state becomes embedded in the animal's memory at a neurological level, not as a story, as a physical fact about what that human's presence predicts. The body remembers what the mind never consciously processed, and it takes a long time, with a very different kind of repeated experience, to overwrite that record. This is why animals that have been poorly handled in the past are not simply fearful in general. They are often calm around most humans and then extremely reactive around specific ones. Specific postures, specific approach speeds, specific kinds of eye contact. The animal is not being irrational. It is being precise. It has a record, and the record is more detailed than the observer usually realizes. In 2019, a research team led by ethologist Jennifer Vonk at Oakland University in Michigan published results from a comparative study on how captive bears, large felids, and primates responded to regular care staff versus unfamiliar visitors who had been coached to adopt equivalent calm body language and equivalent approach patterns. The assumption going in was that if the unfamiliar visitors successfully mimicked the behavioral markers of familiar handlers, the animals' stress responses would be similar. They were not. The animals consistently showed differentiated responses even when external raters watching video footage of the interactions could not reliably distinguish the familiar staff from the coached strangers. The variable the animals were responding to was behavioral history across time. Animals managed by the same handler consistently for 6 months or more showed neurological stress markers that were 30 to 40% lower during handling sessions than animals managed by rotating staff, even when the rotating staff scored equivalently on external behavioral assessments of calm. The animal was not just reading the current moment. It was holding a running record of previous interactions and updating what can only be described as a biological ledger. Each interaction was an entry. Each entry updated the animal's working assessment of whether this specific individual, in this specific context, had been safe before. An animal does not extend trust because a person appears calm during a single encounter. It extends trust because a person has been predictable across multiple encounters over time. Every approach that did not become a threat, every entrance that was not followed by pain or restriction, every moment when the animal communicated discomfort, through posture or vocalization or movement, and the human in front of it adjusted rather than continued. These are entries in a ledger running in biological systems that predate the mammalian cortex by hundreds of millions of years. This is the part that complicates the popular idea that certain people simply have a gift. Some people do carry themselves in ways that read as non-threatening almost automatically. But what most of them share across species and contexts is not a mystical attunement. It is a behavioral vocabulary they have either been taught or arrived at through accumulated experience, combined with a patience for repetition that most people do not think to apply to interactions across species lines. They are consistent. They read what the animal outputs, and they adjust their input accordingly. They do not override signals of discomfort because they are on a timeline. They do not need the interaction to be a success today, and they come back tomorrow. If this is making you think, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. This channel only exists because of the people who share these videos, and I don't take that lightly. The horse trainers who developed what became known in the 1980s as natural horsemanship were not discovering a new relationship with horses. They were recovering a very old one. Monty Roberts, working in California through the 1970s, spent years observing Mustang herd dynamics in the high desert of Nevada and identified a communication system among horses built almost entirely on body angle, spatial pressure, and gaze direction. When a horse in a herd needed another horse to move, it aligned its body at a specific angle and directed pressure forward. When it wanted to invite approach, it turned its head away, dropped its posture, and waited. The signal system was not trained into the horses. It was the language they already spoke. When Roberts brought those signals into the round pen and used them with untrained horses that had no prior positive experience with humans, animals labeled dangerous or unworkable were showing voluntary approach within 20 minutes. Not because Roberts had been kind to them during those 20 minutes. He had sent them around the pen using the same pressure signals a led horse would use to move a herd member away from a resource. And then he stopped. He dropped his angle. He turned away. He waited. And the horse approached. Not because it had been trained to, because it had been invited, in the language it already understood, and it chose to accept the invitation. The behavioral mechanism is more straightforward than the terminology suggests. Roberts was removing threat signals, then offering an approach invitation in vocabulary the horse recognized from its own social world, then stepping back and allowing the horse to make a decision. The decision the horse made was not trained behavior. It was the outcome of a genuine assessment. This is where the research lands on something that numerical data struggles to fully contain. There is a threshold in many human-animal interactions where the calculation shifts, where the animal stops running an active threat assessment and begins doing something that looks, from the outside, like preference. The dog that follows you from room to room without being called. The cat that selects your lap from 12 available options with no apparent logic. The wild crow that learns a specific human face. That last one deserves its own moment. Researcher John Marsluff at the University of Washington conducted a series of studies beginning in the mid-2000s, examining whether wild American crows could recognize individual human faces and maintain those associations over time. His team trapped and banded crows on the Seattle campus while wearing specific rubber masks. In the weeks and months that followed, crows in the area would scold and mob the researchers when those masks appeared, while ignoring people in other masks or no masks at all. The crows were not responding to something general about the people. They were responding to specific stored identities. When Marsluff published results in Animal Cognition in 2011, the findings showed that crows were not only recognizing individual faces across years, but were actively recruiting other crows into the shared threat response. Birds that had never been trapped or interacted with the original research team in any way were scolding the masks because they had received social information from birds that had. The threat was attached to a specific identity and transmitted across the social network of the local crow population. That is not a loose use of the word instinct. That is individual recognition, long-term memory, social transmission of learned information, and targeted behavioral response operating simultaneously in a brain roughly the size of a walnut, and it cuts in both directions. The same capacity that allows a crow to remember a threat for years allows it to remember the person who left food on the same fence post 17 times. Both are entries in the same ledger. Marsluff's team followed up that work with neuroimaging studies of crow brain activity during face recognition tasks. The regions activating in crow brains when they processed familiar versus unfamiliar human faces were analogous in function to regions involved in human social and threat processing. The crows were not doing something primitive, they were doing something structurally similar to what humans do when we recognize a face we have reason to be cautious about. The architecture is different, the computation is the same. This is the part of the story that tends to unsettle people, and probably should. The idea that we can approach any animal as a blank slate, that how we are in a single moment is what the animal sees, is not supported by how these animals actually work. The animal is always comparing the present to its record of the past. It is always asking, implicitly, whether what is happening now is consistent with what has happened before. And inconsistency, even when the new interaction is objectively gentler than previous ones, is itself a data point that gets entered into the assessment. In 2022, a research team at the University of Vienna published results from a study examining how domestic dogs respond to the emotional states of unfamiliar humans when those states are being actively suppressed. Two groups of humans participated, one group that was in a genuine state of calm, and one group that was experiencing moderate internal stress but had been coached to present neutral facial expressions and equivalent body language. Dogs interacted with individuals from both groups under controlled conditions. Observers watching video footage of the human participants could not reliably distinguish between the calm and suppressed stress groups based on visible behavior. The dogs showed consistent cortisol elevation in the presence of the suppressed stress group. The researchers traced what the dogs were reading to a cluster of signals the humans were not consciously controlling. Minor elevation in breathing rate that accompanies sympathetic nervous system activation. Slight postural shifts that occur beneath the threshold of conscious regulation, and changes in skin chemistry that directly affected the olfactory information the dog was receiving from the person's body. The dog was not reading a performance of calm. It was reading the actual physiological state of the person standing in front of it. The actual state, not the presented one. This is the finding that changes the frame of the entire conversation. The person who believes they are calm around animals but is not, is fully legible. The body tells the truth the mind is concealing. And the person who genuinely carries no anxiety into the interaction, who has no agenda about the outcome, and no urgency about whether this specific encounter succeeds, broadcasts exactly that. Not as an intention, as a set of measurable physical facts that the animal's sensory systems were built across millions of years to detect and decode. You are already in that room before you walk through the door. The dog that crossed the floor and sat at your feet was not reading your intentions. It was reading your physiology. The rate at which your diaphragm moved when you breathed. The angle of your shoulders when you settled into stillness, the direction your eyes traveled when they moved across the room, and whether they stopped on the dog or passed over it like furniture. The specific chemistry of what you were carrying in your body, from whatever the hour before that moment had been. None of those things were chosen. All of them were real, and all of them were information. Animals live inside that information stream the way humans live inside visual information, constantly receiving it, constantly processing it, constantly updating assessments of what the environment contains and what it means for survival. For most of the time, mammals have shared this planet. The ability to distinguish a predator moving carefully from a genuinely non-threatening presence was not a social skill. It was the primary skill, the one that determined whether the afternoon ended with you alive or with you as the evidence that the system works. What we call trust in an animal is the accumulated weight of that assessment arriving at a conclusion, not a feeling, a biological verdict, updated across every interaction, held in systems that run below language and below anything resembling conscious deliberation. Safe, not safe, approach, retreat, unknown, wait for more data. The fact that the verdict sometimes generates what looks like affection from the outside, the horse that leans its full weight against your shoulder, the dog that chooses the floor beside your chair over every other square foot of available space, the crow that returns to the same fence post when a specific person appears and does not return for anyone else. That is real. That is not anthropomorphism or wishful thinking or coincidence. It is the output of a genuine assessment process. But it is an output, and the input that generated it began long before you walked into the room. The people that animals consistently move toward are not always the kindest people in the room. What they share, across species and contexts and decades of documented observation, is a specific quality of consistency. They bring the same body into the same space and do the same things with it over time. They do not need the animal to trust them today. They come back tomorrow, and the animal's nervous system, which was built precisely for this kind of pattern recognition extending across time, notices. Not all at once. The way a ledger fills. Every interaction is an entry. Every entry updates the verdict. And the person who has been making the same entry, reliably and without urgency, over sufficient time, stops being an unknown entity and becomes something far more specific. Someone the animal has assessed, across multiple data points, in multiple contexts, across multiple physiological states, and placed into a category that opens the door to something that looks, from the outside, a great deal like trust. What is strange about this, when you sit with it, is that the animal is often doing a more rigorous version of the assessment we say we want to do with each other, not taking the first impression at face value, not accepting the performance of calm over the reality of the body, weighting history over presentation, updating the record when the evidence changes, requiring consistency across time before extending something that cannot be easily withdrawn. By those standards, the animal is not being primitive. It is being careful in a way that took millions of years to refine. The question of why animals trust some humans and not others turns out to be a question about what those humans have been. Consistently, in the presence of something that was watching with considerably more precision than they knew. The animal was not seeing their intentions. It was seeing their body, their history, their actual state. And in many cases, it saw something the human had not yet seen in themselves. Thank you for watching until the end. If this changed how you see something, check out the videos on screen. I think they will hit the same way. And subscribe if you haven't. See you in the next one.